Welcome.
Hey, good morning and welcome to Gruhn Guitars. My name is Joe Spann. I'm the appraiser here. Many of you would know me as the author of Spann's Guide to Gibson, a book about Gibson during the pre-war period. We're going to have George on in just a minute, but I'm going to answer the first question today. And the question is from Alex. And this is what Alex said. As you have explained in detail to millions of people worldwide over these past 51 years, the instruments produced by Martin and Gibson during the early 1930s and into the early 1940s are coveted by players and collectors. Both design and build peaked, an alignment of skill sets giving us a golden era. My question is about the craftspeople who were designing and building these amazing guitars. Well, and mandolins and banjos too. Do we know who these people were at Gibson and Martin? Was there a Rosie the Riveter phenomenon during the late 30s and early 40s that brought women into greater numbers at Gibson and Martin? Well, Alex, we thank you for your question, and I'm going to try and take a stab at it. During the writing phase and research phase of my book, I did some very in-depth research into the people that worked at Gibson during the pre-war period. What Gibson looked for basically was a cabinet maker, somebody who had the skills to work in a furniture factory, a coffin building factory, a piano case builder, that kind of thing. Kalamazoo was a very industrial town, and they had a lot of those kinds of things going on. So there was a ready supply of skilled cabinet makers in Kalamazoo. And that was just a good starting point. If you were going to build a mandolin or a guitar or a banjo, you had some of the skill set they needed. Certainly, they would teach you what you needed to know. But they felt like that was a good place to start. Some of the old newspaper ads for Gibson where they're looking for employees, they're looking for cabinet makers. The factory was largely people of Dutch extraction. In fact, Kalamazoo itself was largely an immigrant town with a huge Dutch population. And it was a little difficult to get work at Gibson if you weren't part of that Dutch population. Normally, a father would get on and his son would follow him. Uncles and nephews and things would go to work there. Not a lot of women on the factory floor in the early years. Certainly quite a few of them in the main office on the second floor. But out on the production floor, it was mostly the guys, and they were mostly all Dutch. Now that did change as World War II came on, and a lot of those guys got drafted or volunteered, went into the Army or into other essential industries, and Gibson did bring on a tremendous number of women for the first time. Prior to that, women had been involved, as I said, in the office and also in making strings. Gibson made their own strings right there in the factory. They had a number of large string making machines, and Gibson employed women to do that work. But then as World War II came on, they brought them on in other capacities as well, and they did quite well. If you look at the roster of Gibson's employees after World War II, that demographic has changed tremendously. It's not just the guys on the factory floor anymore. A lot of women there also, and that remained constant even into the 50s and 60s. A lot of women that worked at Gibson. So yeah, it was kind of a Rosie the Riveter situation there, Alex. And they proved themselves. They were quite skilled at the jobs that they were asked to do. Gibson did war work during World War II. One of the things they did was produce glider skids from balsa wood and spruce. They used some of their spruce to produce those glider skids. And they did other fine machine work as well, making metal parts for bomb sites, I believe, if I remember correctly. So they were using some of their machinery to do that kind of work. A number of the old employees that I interviewed for my book talked about the fact that you could always tell an older employee at Gibson by the fact that he was missing fingers on either hand. The big bandsaw or the pin router or whatever wasn't particularly a great safe place to work. So Alex, I hope that answers your question a little bit. I didn't get into Martin. I don't know as much about Martin as I do about Gibson, but I hope that answers your question. And I think George is ready to join us again. So thanks again for tuning in, and we hope that you'll come back and see us every week. Thanks.
And if my original intro didn't come through well, this is, of course, March 26, and I'm already doubly vaccinated, both of my shots. I hope all of you who qualified have done it by now. In Tennessee, by April 5th, apparently, the governor has announced that everybody 16 years of age and older will be qualified to get their shots. And for those who are able to get it, they darn well ought to. We are still socially distancing here in the shop and limiting appointments or entry to 4 customers at a time in the showroom downstairs and 2 at a time upstairs at any one time, plus our employees. We're very much in business, and we're actually doing pre-pandemic quality and quantity of business. So if somebody shows up and doesn't have an appointment, they may not have to wait very long. If they want sincerely to look at the guitars, we're going to find a way to get them in. And if they have a guitar for sale or consignment or needing repair, we're going to get them in. It may take 15 minutes occasionally to wait until there's an opening, but we'll get them all in. And at any rate, I'd like to introduce Tony, who has a question that was submitted. Tony Nagy works in the repair shop and is involved with repair shop management as well as hands-on doing the actual work. He's very knowledgeable and better qualified to answer some questions than I am. So I don't claim to have to know everything. I may be the CEO, chairman, but we have people here who have specific skills which complement each other so that we are stronger for having a team than having only one guy who knows everything. And nobody knows everything. If they claim to know everything, you know that they are not trustworthy. Anyway, here's Tony.
Hey guys, how are you guys doing today? I have a question here submitted by Mark Frisbee. The specific question is this: why is the G string on acoustic guitars so temperamental when tuning? It oftentimes pops in the nut while tuning, jumping to a higher pitch, which then requires tuning it back down to the desired pitch. This happens on both my inexpensive Fender acoustic and my Martin custom shop model. What causes this and what can be done about it? Well, what happens is there are a couple of things that aid and abet this. One of them is sometimes the nut slot is not exactly the right size for whatever gauge strings you're using. And that G string is still wound. So if the string slot is just a little too tight and since it's wound, it wants to catch. And the other factor is that if you look at your acoustic guitar headstock, the 2 center strings, the D and the G, have the most angle as they leave the nut going to the tuner. And this will also help that want to catch in that slot. So the couple of things that you need to have your local repairman do is, first of all, make sure that nut slot is just big enough for that G string to travel through without catching when you tune, so it can go back and forth smoothly. And also, if you angle the back end of the slot, so it also doesn't want to catch on the back of the nut when it leaves. So any of those pinching, every time you tune up the string and it goes tink, and it makes a big jump in pitch, the fact is it's catching in your nut slot, and that nut slot needs to be made with the proper width as it hits the bottom there. And the back of it, since it angles coming out of the nut, you need to angle that a little bit so that the string can follow a more direct path to the tuner for tuning. Hope that helps you out there, Mark. You guys have a great day. Turn it back over to George.
Okay, I am back. John Davis submitted a question: what is the status of the vintage mandolin market now and going forward? This is easier to answer where it is now than where it is going forward, because as Yogi Berra said, predictions are very difficult because they're about the future, and it hasn't happened yet. But predictions are at best a guess. And I know from past experience collecting and dealing instruments for at least since 1963, and actually developing an interest in them earlier, that some things I predicted have come true, and some surprised me considerably. So it's not that easy. But so far as vintage mandolins, I would say in general, the mandolin market is quite healthy for utilitarian instruments. For the most expensive vintage, highly collectible mandolins, namely one particular model and age period, that is F5 master model Gibson mandolins, made, they were introduced in 22, but those that were signed by acoustic engineer Lloyd Lohr from 22 through into December of 24 are the most sought after mandolins ever made in the history of the instrument, and to this day are still considered to be unsurpassed. Those peaked about late 2006 through early 2007. And it was somewhat of a market bubble, bid up by speculators. And I've talked before on a number of occasions in this question and answer period over the months that three types of buyers: utility tool users, who don't necessarily care about collectability, but they do very much care about how it feels, looks, and sounds; collectors, who care extremely much about originality, historical significance, but also want things that are very, very good. They don't collect things that aren't good. They're collectible for a reason. They're iconic instruments that are highly desirable, but they can bid prices higher than utility tool users are willing to pay. But then speculators are the ones who see the prices here. It's been doing that. They anticipate it will do that in the future. And maybe it will and maybe it won't. But if they bid it too high, they get to a point where if you have this cliff here, and this is a 3,000 foot or 3,000 meter drop, and utility tool user got about that far and then quit and complained that the hateful collectors bid it up to over here. Oh, well, they dropped out, but the collectors, they still are buying it to keep. But when they start dropping out and complaining that the speculators are doing this out here, chasing the phantom profit, the speculators are buying it not with the intention of keeping it, but to flip it after no more than a year and a half to 2 years. If they outbid the collectors, and I can tell pretty well talking to somebody in the first 3 minutes if they're utility tool user, true collector, or speculator. They ask different questions. They look at them differently. They hold them differently. I know which one they are. And if I see on any particular model that past price X, that the only people buying are speculators and they're bidding it up dramatically, I recognize that there is likely to be a big correction within 2 years. And the F5 mandolins did face that. You have here an example of an F5. Here's the original case, rectangular, neat looking case actually. Interior of the case, mandolin residing in it. We have the 1924 signed F5, which I will remove from the case now because it's a nice form-fit case inside. This mandolin in 24 was $250, but the case was extra. And putting that in perspective, in 1924, a Model T Ford new cost $265, and it didn't need a case. So this one with the case cost more money new than buying a Model T Ford. But this is a nice, clean condition F5 from 24, which at the peak of the market in late 06 through early 07 would have brought about $175 to even as much as $180,000. And right now we have this one priced at $105,000, which is actually a good deal, but it's less than it was at its peak. And where it will go in the future, future is difficult. We know that prices are impacted by the economy, but also by demographics. It's a different generation of people buying these things and looking for them. Musical trends, F5s were largely played recently, at least, and by recently I mean in the last 75 years, they've been played only by bluegrass players for the most part. Very few classical mandolin players are actively playing anything professionally, but if they are, they're often enough not necessarily playing an F5, they're quite content with something like an F4. And the F4, before the introduction of the F5, here's an F4 from 1923, made shortly after the F5 was introduced, but the F4 goes all the way back early, it's even as far back as 1902. But this body shape came in 1910. The previous one had a little extra point here, and the body was a little bigger. And the ornamentation was slightly different, but they did make an F4 early on. And this mandolin right now is worth basically about the same as it was worth in 06 or 07, because the bluegrassers didn't go so much for these. Bill Monroe didn't play one of these. It doesn't have that chopped chord sound like an F5, but it still was the best mandolin Gibson made, the highest quality and most expensive mandolin they made prior to the introduction of the F5. But the prices on utilitarian mandolins and even collectible mandolins other than F5s have held their own very well. Now, for the future, I think that the F4 will do just fine because it would cost more money to build a replica than that particular F4 might bring. Good F4s from as early as the teens, like 1913, 14, 15, 1919, they bring around $6,500 for one that's nice. A 23 model like that one that I just held up can push as much as 10,000. It's a lower period instrument. It has the adjustable truss rod, but it's bringing about the same now that it would have at its peak. And where it goes from here, I'm not sure. Problem with not sure is I need the help here from my prop, the crystal ball. I've often said, I don't have a crystal ball, though, that tells me the exact answer to some of these questions. What it does tell me, if I look through the crystal ball, first you can see, if I hold something right up to it, there it is. And see, it comes out right side up, but magnified. But if you get back at a distance, ooh, see, it went from right side up to upside down. And that's the problem with things when you look at a distance. What it shows in the future is your whole world is turned upside down, and we don't know what's going to happen. But I would say that the market for mandolins right now There's a lot of good builders doing new instruments of quality. A lot of it is small individual luthiers doing this, but there's some very nice mandolins being made. Are they better than an old F5? No. Are they coming surprisingly close? Some of them, depends on who's doing it, but there's some darn good instruments being made right now. And the future for mandolins to be played is very good because they're no longer strictly just for bluegrass. They appear at plenty of country. There are people playing classical mandolin, there's jazz mandolin, there's folk stuff, there's pop stuff. Mandolin is a versatile instrument, far more so, say, than tenor banjo, which has never been used for much other than Dixieland. Although even tenor banjo and plectrum banjo, 4-string, is more versatile than you might think. One of the best renditions I've ever heard of the Beatles tune, When I'm 64, is one that was done by a Dixieland group doing Beatles tunes. And When I'm 64 sounded so perfect on those instruments, it sounded to me like it was probably composed on them. And the Beatles actually had heard tenor banjo, and they were imitating some of those sounds. But British skiffle music indeed did use tenor banjo for something other than Dixieland. At any rate, my ability to predict the future with precision has not been perfected. And when it does get perfected, I might make billions or trillions in the stock market. Because if I really could predict the future, then I could tell you even things like how much Amazon.com will be worth later, or what will Tesla stock be worth in 10 years. I would have known long before any of the great price jumps. The fact that I'm not a trillionaire right now tells you that I do not have a perfect ability to predict the future. But while I can't predict the future, I can predict that momentarily, Corey from my sales staff is going to come before you and answer a listener question because he's better able to answer this particular question than I am. Therefore, here's Corey. And I predict he's going to appear momentarily.
Thank you, George. That was an interesting lead-in. I liked it. Okay, so we had a question from Karsten. The question was, could you please tell me what types of capacitors were used in Gibson guitars late 50s and 60s? Especially interested in mid-early 60s. And how do they affect tone between versions? Does it vary greatly? Well, I'll talk a little bit about capacitors and what they do. Because some people know that they're in electronic items, but what do they do? Well, basically they store a charge is what they do. There's a lot of scientific words and things that I can start saying about how that charge is stored, but just know that they're necessary and they do affect tone. Even when your tone pot is wide open, the capacitor is affecting the tone, what value it's at, and they're valued most of the time. If you pull apart a guitar, you'll see that they'll on the vintage end of things, let's say from the 50s, most likely a 22, and then you'll see a UF after it, and that's the abbreviation for microfarad, and that's that's how they're measured in microfarads usually. Microfarad refers to the size of the capacitor. That's really all it is. How much is it allowing that capacitor to store a charge? But there are other things that affect tone, and I know that was part of the question. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking a little bit ahead of what it actually is. It's a little bit more simple, I think, because there's a lot of variables that are in this equation. If that's what we're looking to do, is to say, how do caps affect tone? Well, what kind of a cap are we using? Most likely in those times, in that time frame, with Gibson guitars especially. And those are real easy to figure out what you got because there's a plate on the back of the guitar with 4 screws. You take it off, you look inside, all your wiring is there. You have your pots are there, you have your wire, and you have your caps. Everything, and it's visual and it's easy to see. And if you don't know what you're looking at, nowadays, you can take a picture with your phone and send it to your repair guy and say, what do I have going on here? And he most likely can tell you if everything's wired correctly, or he can make a suggestion. Or you can just compare it on Google. You can Google it and compare the photo that you have or the open electronics cavity. So it's that easy. But what would you see if you opened a late 50s, early 60s Les Paul cavity? You'd most likely see either an orange drop capacitor, which there's no doubt what that is. It looks like you took 2 pieces of wire and dipped it in some wax or in some candy. I mean, that's why they call them the orange drops. A bumblebee capacitor, which will be banded. It'll be a cylinder, a small cylinder, which is banded with different colors, denoting what the value is. And that's how you would tell the value from there. Kind of like a resistor, if you ever opened up an electronics component and you saw a resistor, which would have a colored band. It looks something like that, but it's generally black, yellow, orange, yellow, and black, and that's why they call them the bumblebees. And then of course, you'll have the Sprague Black Beauties, black. Again, it'll be cylindrical, shaped. I'm going to be black. Now, thinking about this, I thought the most simple thing. The orange drops are known to be, and this is how it would be explained to you most likely. The orange drops are mid-range friendly, which means that the way that they're set up, it's going to affect the mid-range more than anything else when you move your pots around. Bumblebees are known to give you the mellow highs, rich bass tones, and actually true mids. So when you move your tone control, you'll be affecting the highs and the lows, maybe not the mids so much. The classics are the Black Beauties, which you'll find in Les Pauls and SGs from that time frame, early 60s, late 50s. They're similar to bumblebees, but a little bit more noticeable on the highs and the lows when you move the tone control. Now, getting into other things that affect tone, what kind of pickups do you have? What kind of wire are you using? What kind of pots? George and I have had a conversation about pots just recently, and how pots, potentiometers from that time frame were garbage, really. I mean, they weren't well-made components. They were grabbed and used. It wasn't until recently, when I say recently, the past probably 40 years, 35 years or so, in that time frame, more modern stuff, components got better. Believe it or not, today, you could buy a pickup, an inexpensive pickup that sounds pretty good. That luxury wasn't afforded back in the time frame where electric guitars were still relatively kind of a new thing. We got to remember, Gibson came out with a Les Paul in '52. So by '59, it wasn't decades that they had to experiment. Also, changing pots between in a guitar that is from '59 or '52 it's not something that I would do or that I would recommend that you do. I would most likely replace something that was failing with something that was familiar to that circuit. And I would only replace it if it was failing. Maybe not even if I was collecting the instruments, wasn't planning on playing it, I might not mess with it at all. Leave it all original. And then I would have no idea what that bumblebee sounded like inside of that guitar, or what the orange drop sounds like in it. It's easier to play around with modern stuff today than it is to, for me anyway, conscious, with my conscience. I'm not going into an old instrument, 50s, even 60s, 70s. I might. Collectability is not as great as something from the 50s, but those are all again, like I said, those are all factors that are in these equations. What I would suggest that somebody does if they have something that's failing and that they want to play is to replace it with something that would have been in that instrument. And it's easy enough to do the research or just look back on this Zoom conversation, this conversation that we're having. Or if you have something that's a little bit more modern and you want to play around, then play around with them. The capacitors are not expensive. They're pennies on the dollar. They're not an expensive thing. You can get an expensive capacitor, but you can also get an inexpensive paper capacitor that may do the same thing, or it may just be an inexpensive thing that you put in and you go, wow, that sounds really cool. You don't know until you mess around with that. But most likely, I'm not going to be suggesting that we mess around on something that is from the original question from the 50s or 60s. I would replace it with, most likely, it would be a Black Beauty or a Bumblebee. I've seen the orange drops in there. Anyway, I hope that I answered part of the question or some of the question, most of the question. If I haven't even gotten to, maybe I've sparked some new questions, you can reach me via email. I'd be happy to go back and forth, or you can call me on the shop line here. But my email is Corey, which is COREY @guitars.com. Or you can get me here, 615-256-2033. Ask for Corey, and we can continue the conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to George. That's my, I just saw into the crystal ball and I realized that that's what the future holds for you guys. Thank you.
Okay, we have more questions. And if anybody has others they'd like to submit, we'll try to get to them, even if they just come in during the show. So by all means, keep the questions coming. George, do you have any statistics on labor as a percentage of variable? This is from John C. Variable manufacturing cost for the major domestic producers, Martin, Gibson, Taylor, or Fender. I read that it could be as high as 80%. If that is accurate, can these companies compete favorably in the future with Asian companies that have very low labor costs and modernized factories? I would appreciate your thoughts. Well, it depends very much on what kind of guitar you're making. But I remember very well a conversation that I had in 1974 during a visit to Japan. And at that time, labor costs in Japan were much cheaper than in the US. Land cost more there. Fuel cost more there. They didn't have any fuel much in Japan other than what they could import because it was a volcanic island, no oil, no natural gas. Not much in the way of raw materials to build guitars. They did have some forest area, but that was all national treasure that they wouldn't cut. They'd want to cut other people's forests elsewhere and import the wood. But at any rate, the Moritaida company, Takuya Inoue was the export director, and he told me a story that they had made a prototype set of samples of what would be an import version of some Fender guitars that they thought Fender might be interested in to have as a student or a cheaper line import product. And they showed them to folks at Fender and gave a price quote. And the response from Fender was that that's interesting, but what's interesting especially to us though at Fender is that the price you've just quoted to make a Telecaster clone is more money than it costs us for materials and labor to make it right here in California. So no thanks. Making solid body guitars can be automated to a very high degree, which is one reason, for example, why the Germans have been able, even now, to continue to make a lot of component parts such as tuning gears, bridges, and tailpieces. Germany is one of the most expensive labor markets anywhere, but they can still, through being well automated and technically very skilled, they can reduce the actual labor cost per component where they can be competitive if their quality is really high. And there is still a good bit of that in the USA. So far as acoustic guitars, I have yet to see a import from Japan, Korea, or China that equals what Martin can do on an acoustic, or for that matter, equals what Taylor does on an acoustic, or Santa Cruz, or Collings. The Americans are still producing something that's really, really fine, and the people who are seriously interested are willing to pay the price. But the hours of labor that go into making a fine acoustic instrument are very considerably greater than what goes into making a really fine solid body electric, particularly if it's an item like a Fender, where there's no binding on the neck, there's no binding on the body, there's typically no fancy inlay work. The actual woodworking components are relatively easy to do. And even on the custom shop stuff, it's not near as much work as doing an acoustic guitar. There's not as many parts, and parts don't have as much ornamentation. But you start looking at the number of parts and the number of hours of labor that go into it, and the fact is that it's hard for the Asians to make a Fender style guitar much cheaper than Fender can do it. And Fender does it to very high quality. And on acoustics, it is true that labor costs get high, but in general also, US guitar factories don't pay as much as folks make in computer industry or in some other industries. This is not necessarily the instant road to wealth and riches. So the margins on building guitars in the USA are such that, at least on high-end instruments, the USA is likely to be competitive for a long time. Maybe, I would say, at least in my lifetime, but I'm 75. On the other hand, my great uncle Otto did live to be 105, and he didn't retire. Sister Emma only made it to 102, but still, I'm not planning on retirement as long as I am physically and mentally competent to be here. I intend to be here. But nobody's guaranteed permanent good health. Nobody has for sure the knowledge of exactly how long they will live unless they know for a definite fact that they're going to be executed tomorrow. Then they know exactly how long they're going to live. But I don't have that. I don't have any terminal condition. I could last a long time. I hope I do, but I hope it's quality. But in the meantime, the question still, can the US remain competitive? On the high-end instruments, they are competitive here. And a high percentage of the sales from Gibson, Martin, Fender, Collings, Santa Cruz, and a variety of others are export. That would not be happening if the US product did not have that type prestige. So basically, you name any company, Martin, Fender, Taylor, Gibson, Rickenbacker, you can just go on and on. And almost all of them, Larrivee guitars. We talked to Jean Larrivee at a NAMM show a couple of years ago. And he was showing me guitars, that ultra fancy, customized pieces, primarily being sold in China. So the Chinese have customers over there who are buying high-end American instruments. So they're willing to pay the price for what can be made in the USA. But the percentage profit margin at Martin or Collings or Santa Cruz is probably not as high as at Fender. But the point is, they're all able to compete. And they don't share with me their percentage of profit. But what I do know is that all of these companies are doing a high percentage of their business as export. It's a worldwide global market, and it would not be that if these products were not competitive on some level. You can compete on price, you can compete on quality, and you can compete on innovation. And obviously, if you have an artist endorsement, you may just compete by having the right endorsers. But the right endorsers won't sell product if it stinks. And the Americans have been in the past and are still now and probably will for quite a long time be competitive. What they're not competitive on is building student model intro level guitars. That can be done cheaper in Asia, particularly in China and Indonesia. But China and Indonesia do not have the reputation yet for building many really high-end, although there are some Chinese instruments, and I talked about some of them in the past that are pretty darn good. Altamira classical guitars and the Django Reinhardt style gypsy jazz guitars that Altamira makes are very good. And I've shown them before on camera. They're good. But that's not something that there's very many USA makers building that type of gypsy jazz models, but the Altamira classicals are remarkably good. But they're still not as sought as high-end Spanish or some of the European and American classicals. There's a market for high-end instruments, just as there's a market for high-end automobiles. There are still people who buy a Rolls Royce or a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. So there is a market for that, and we are still competitive. Also, what Corey was saying before on tone and volume pots, capacitors, etc., is that in the old days, none of those were actually designed for musical instruments. Those were capacitors and tone and volume pots that were designed for the electronics industry. So radio, movies, TV, those had the research and development money. And the type capacitors and volume pots that were used were not specifically designed for guitars. Pickups, on the other hand, were specifically designed for guitars. And I have yet to see any new pickup that, in my opinion, sounds better than a good 52 or 3 Telecaster lead pickup or a good 57 through 60 patent applied for humbucking pickup. Pickup technology was really good in the 50s. And they're still great, but there are new guitars made right now that are remarkably good. And the worst quality guitars, I've said many times in my opinion, probably in the 70s. And even the electrics of the 70s are still quite playable. The acoustics of the 70s, in some cases, as far as I'm concerned, were unplayable junk, particularly Gibson at that point, produced some very poor guitars. The new Gibson acoustics are quite good. and the Gibsons made back in Ted McCarty's era and earlier, pre-World War II on up through the mid-60s, were quite good. But at any rate, that's enough for that question. Mike C. I watch your webinar every week and enjoy it very much and learn a lot. My question is, I'm looking to buy a 1968 Gibson ES-143, all original, except it has had a neck reset. Does a neck reset decrease the value of the guitar, and is it significant? The guitar otherwise is in good shape and plays well. Well, I assume if it had a neck set, there was a reason for doing it. The set was either done improperly on day one, or something happened to cause that joint to come undone and it needed to be reset. It's rare to see an ES-335 that needs a neck set, but yes, we do encounter occasionally a Les Paul or a 335 or other model Gibson that for some reason escaped from the factory without a proper neck set angle. And if that is the case, there's a good reason to do the neck set. And after the neck set is done, it's going to play better than it did before. So is it going to affect the value? Well, if the neck set was done competently by an expert technician, it's worth more after the neck set than it was before when it needed a neck set. If the neck set is done properly, it will be virtually invisible and should not impact the value of the instrument. If, on the other hand, somebody did it who is not very skilled, they can really do a lot of damage and the instrument will be devalued. But good repair work enhances the value over what the instrument was worth prior to the work. If it needed the work and it was unplayable, then fixing it right improves value. But good repairs still do not increase value to necessarily being exactly as much as a pristine, totally original instrument that needs nothing. But repair work done properly, restoration and repair, if you have to know what to do, what not to do, you don't want to do things that will negatively impact value or change the originality to the point where it's no longer appealing to a collector. You don't try to make everything look brand new. If it has honest, normal wear, you leave that alone. But you have to know what to do, how to do it. You have to know what not to do. And if it does need the work enhances the value of the instrument as opposed to what it was worth before you did the work. Phil says, please describe the difference between a collector and a player/collector concerning guitar collecting. And I said earlier in today's presentation that if I talk to somebody for as much as a minute to 3 minutes, I generally know what they are. Are they a utility tool user? Are they a true collector? Or are they simply a speculator? Speculators are okay as customers. If they want to pay my price, I'll sell to them. But I don't think that a market is healthy when only speculators are buying. If they push the price up beyond what anybody who wants to keep one has ever been known to pay, that's a market that's going to go into a correction phase soon. And I don't need a crystal ball to tell me that. But the utility tool user player, when they come in, they may have a particular model in mind because they have heard of one or played one or know an artist who uses one. But as soon as you hand them the instrument, they start playing it. They're not necessarily looking it over physically very carefully. They're feeling it. They're listening to it. They're playing music on it. And often enough, when they play, they may not even have their eyes open. They may have their eyes closed and be just concentrating only on feel and sound. But they don't ask a whole lot of questions about originality. That's typical enough of the utility tool user. They're also limited in how much they're willing to pay. They're willing to pay whatever it's worth to them as a utilitarian tool, and they don't pay extra for collectability. But the true collectors, they pick it up and they give it the complete forensic exam. They start from the top and go down. They cover the whole front, sides, back. And they ask for a mirror to look inside. Total forensic exam. They know what they're looking at. They ask a lot of questions regarding anything that you know that's ever been altered. And after they've looked carefully, then they may play it. In fact, they probably will play it. They usually do know how to play. But before they ever play a note on it, they carefully inspect the instrument. And they may notice things in the first 1 or 2 seconds where they'll ask a question, oh, what's been done here? Or they'll just say, I noticed that the tuners have changed. Those people can be very good customers, but they are knowledgeable. And they are still the best customers for high-end vintage instruments, because we know that they will also not only pay a good price for what they want, but they will take good care of it. They will be a good custodian of that instrument. And I do feel very strongly that we are here as custodians. People have a finite lifespan, but some of these instruments can last hundreds of years with proper care. I've already shown other instruments in previous presentations, like we have an 1836 Martin, we have an 1842 Martin, I've got 1902, and I have a 1922 single 045 Martin. And plenty of good instruments that are old, and with proper care, some of the ones that are over 100 years old can look virtually new. But at any rate, the true collectors ask totally different questions, but they take very good care of the instruments. They're great custodians. And one thing to keep in mind is the collectors do a lot of educating. They are the ones who often write books about instruments. They write books about the history of companies. And they are the ones who educate a lot of the utility tool users, and often enough even educate the dealers. And they help create the market. These are serving a very important function. But ultimately, without players, there wouldn't be a market. They wouldn't have ever been manufactured in the first place if there were no players. Players are important. We need them to have a successful musical instrument market. And the instruments never would have been designed or built otherwise. But there is that interplay between collectors and musicians. But also keep in mind, when musicians complain that the collectors have hoarded things and they can't afford one, it's true that a lot of musicians over the years haven't taken the best care of their instruments, and sometimes hot rodded or even pretty well mutilated them. The collectors put them in protective custody and keep them in a safe environment until they're valuable enough that you can let them back out into a world that now treasures them and will take good care of them. If it weren't for violin collectors back in the 1800s who were hoarding a lot of the old Stradivari, Guarneri, Amati, and other Italian violins, none of them would have survived to this day, and we wouldn't even know about them as much because they would have long since been destroyed. And so collectors serve a very valuable function, educating people and protecting the instruments until it's safe to let them back into the world where they'll be respected and cared for. Rich says, recently purchased a Gibson Birdland from your shop and curious about the history of the shorter scale, 23.5 inches. It's my understanding that Hank Garland tried out Barry Galbraith's Stromberg G5 shorter scale before ordering his own. And later, his and Billy Bird's input went into the Birdland model. This may have been lost to history, but any idea what prompted Strombergs to build a shorter scale, guessing that the G5 was too pricey to be intended as a student model. Were there other fretted instrument antecedents? Well, Stromberg was an important maker of archtop acoustic guitars. Some people consider them to be the best acoustic rhythm archtops ever made, but it was a very small operation. Charles Stromberg, father, specialized mostly in banjos and drums. Elmer Stromberg, the son, made the guitars starting around 1930 for the guitars. Earlier than that on the banjos and drums. Both Elmer and Charles, father, died in the same year, 1955. So that ended Stromberg's. But why did they make short scale guitars? You're right, it wasn't so kids could play them. It was definitely for adults, but they were not playing simply orchestral rhythm. They were getting into orchestral arrangements and studio arrangements where they were playing modern jazz with, rather than chopped chords for rhythm, they were playing lead and some very complex chords that had long stretches. Most of the rhythm playing that you see, like Freddie Green with Count Basie, those and the Western swing players, they weren't even playing full chords. They were usually playing 1, 2, or 3 strings, rarely more than 4. And for some of those guys, they didn't play anything at all on the B string or the high E. Just about everything Freddie Green did was on the 4 wound strings, and they weren't doing long stretches. So for them, a full long scale was just fine. But when they were starting to do these, Barry Galbraith and some of these guys were doing complex, very rich, full chords, but they were doing slow, pretty, and just things that were physically difficult on the long scale. So these guys wanted a shorter scale. And that's what Barry Galbraith had. It is what Hank Garland saw. Hank Garland was one of the big time session players in Nashville in the 50s. Unfortunately, had an auto accident, which some of the surgery they did on him left him with brain impairment, and he never was a great player after that. But he was very influential in his day. So the Birdland was after Billy Bird and Hank Garland. So Birdland, Billy Bird and Hank Garland. And they were the 2 Gibson endorsers for that model, and they had the exact same scale and similar neck dimensions to Hank Garland's G5 Stromberg. So that's how that came to be. And it's also how that short scale came to be on Stromberg's. It was for a different type of music. And frankly, most people aren't doing much of those type chords now, but for those who do, the short scale still works very, very well. We've got a question from Robert Magus. He ran across an instrument way back in 1971 or 2. I was visiting my uncle in southeastern Indiana. He had this old guitar in his antique shop. Every time I walked in the store to visit, I started plinking on it. He found it entertaining. He told me he'd showed the same guitar to a music professor over at the college and had told him that it wasn't worth much of anything. So Uncle Harry told him that he could just have it, take it home. And after he was looking around, he saw that it was labeled, stamped with the name Maurer inside, M-A-U-R-E-R. And it turns out to be an instrument that was made by the Larson brothers of Chicago, who are one of my favorite makers. But they were small, it was a small 2-man shop. Here's what the guitar looks like. Here's a close-up of the top. You can see it's in less than prime condition, but it is like right in this picture, it's not even strung up fully. The name Mauer is barely visible in there, but it is there. He was hoping to find out what year and exactly what model it was. There was only one known Larson catalog, and it doesn't list this one. Their grandson, Hartman, did a book about Larson guitars, but it's, again, what he was researching on his own, and there was only one known catalog. So basically, it's highly unlikely that the exact model designation on this one is ever going to be clear. Lack of documentation. Joe Spann is great on documentation, but there has to be documents to find. There's a 1932 Mauer and Prairie State catalog, and there's no other known contemporary reference material for the brand. It was contemporary at the time they were made. It's the only known catalog. So Robert Hartman, the grandson of the Larsons, did his reference book, but it's very limited in terms of he's found a lot of guitars to compare, and some of them had dates written in them, but there was only the one known catalog. So what we know in terms of the model name of this particular guitar? No. Do we know it was made by them? Yes, its workmanship is very distinctive, and Mauer is a brand that they made. So that much we do know, but so far as finding out much more, we can't document when there was no historical material to document it from. We can look at guitars, we can talk to people who own them, but since they died in the mid-1940s, as far as talking to original owners who remember much about the Larsons, that's tough to do. And even if it was a musician who bought one new, that doesn't mean he knows much about the history of the company. Michael Callie says, considering replacing bridge pins on some of my acoustics with non-original manufacturer pins, how, if at all, do different bridge pins affect the sound of the guitar? I have my eyes on the liquid metal ones from Martin, but would appreciate your guidance or recommendation. Well, bridge pins have some impact on sound, typically not dramatic. Most of the original pins, early ones, are either wood, ivory, or bone, and they sound good. A lot of the later ones are plastic, and on the D28, D18 Martins, if you look at the ones from the 30s, the true golden era, some of the most amazing sounding guitars I've ever heard for a steel string, they've got plastic bridge pins. Some of them were ivoroid and nitrocellulose. Some of them are other types of plastic. They're black pins, or not. But they are plastic bridge pins, and the guitars sound just fine. If you put ivory bridge pins on, the tonal difference is pretty minimal. The so-called liquid metal bridge pins Martin is using on their new modern deluxe guitars, they are a special, very heavy alloy, and they're expensive. The price of a set of bridge pins of those is over $100. In my opinion, they don't improve the sound. I don't like them. I've tried the modern deluxe model with those pins that come factory installed, and taking them out and tried other pins, and I preferred the other pins. But they have their literature claiming that it improves sustain and volume and tone, but my ears are not telling me that. I do know that if you weigh them, they weigh more than 10 times as much as the standard normal Martin bridge pins. If you want to put a mute on a violin, the violin mutes and a banjo mute, they have a weight on them, and they will add weight to the bridge, and that damps down the tone. Vast improvements in tone, in my opinion, are not likely to come from a different set of bridge pins. But subtle differences, yes, but they are quite subtle. And some of the finest guitars I've ever heard had plain plastic bridge pins that were original. And I didn't hear them get improved from any other bridge pins. Michael O'Neill asked if I have any thoughts on F4 and snakehead Gibson mandolins of the lower era. They're oval hole, the snakehead or A models, pear-shaped body. And the F4s, well, I showed you one earlier. They're good instruments. They're not prime bluegrass instruments because they don't sound like Bill Monroe for those type chopped chords, but for playing jazz, classical, folk, they're great. And I think that they're good investments, but I am not so much saying that if you buy a mandolin of that sort and pay the current price, it can be guaranteed that it's going to go up dramatically. I really can't tell you exactly what they're going to cost in 10 years or 20 years. I've had people ask me how much something's going to be worth in 40 or 50 years. And if you were to ask somebody how much their house is going to be worth in 40 years, they don't know. The building I sold downtown to get the money to buy this one has gone up in value a lot more than I expected it to. And I sold that in late 2012. And no realtor at the time told me it had the potential to do what it's doing now. In fact, the realtors, if they had known that, they'd have been buying that stuff themselves and holding on to it till now. So my own track record is such that I'm not sorry I sold the building, which permitted me to move to the neighborhood here, but I wish I'd kept the parking lot behind it and not sold it along with the building, because it would probably be worth $10 million now. And do I have a perfect track record on either real estate, the stock market, or the instrument market? My crystal ball doesn't work. And stockbrokers don't seem to know the answer either. They often enough can explain things after the fact far, far better than they can predict, which leads me to think that some of their explanations after the fact are also speculation. Sometimes we really don't know why it did what it's going to do. And we sure as heck don't know what the market's going to be 35 years from now on real estate, the stock market, or numerous other things. But we do the best we can with what we got. It's things that have long track records. And if the demographics of the market look good, such that people are still going to want these things, we can be pretty sure that they'll be okay. I mean, we can look and see that Vincent van Gogh paintings have done well for a long time. Michelangelo and Da Vinci, we know that they've been valuable for hundreds of years. It crosses from one generation to the next. Those are ones that are going to be perennial. Gary Llewellyn is asking, what's your guess on the value of Gibson banjos? I don't have to guess on the value of Gibson banjos. I know what they're worth now. I don't know what they'll be worth later. 10 years or 20 years, I can say that some banjos by Gibson from their classic era, flathead master tones that are the primo ones, are bringing less money right now than they did 10 years ago. But how much they'll bring 10 years from now, I can't answer. Will Gibson start building banjos again? They have not been building banjos, at least since the Nashville flood, which was back in 2010, that flooded the spot where they were building Gibson banjos, and they haven't started them back. And the new current owners of Gibson are far more interested in guitars, particularly electric and also acoustic guitars, but not so much on banjos, not enough to start building them again. And They're doing a few mandolins, but not many. It's certainly not their real big emphasis push. But how much will Gibson banjos appreciate in the future? I don't have a good answer for you. It depends very much on the future of bluegrass music, which I also can't tell you. I can tell you that music is evolving, and not everybody's strictly just playing Scruggs style anymore. But there are not any banjo companies in America right now that are producing high numbers of high quality banjos. Huber Banjos in Nashville produces high quality but small quantity. Ohm Banjos in Boulder, Colorado produces high quality but small quantity, in fact, less than they did at their peak, and fewer that are real high-end fancy ones than they did at their peak. The banjo market is an unknown as to where it's going from here. Rick Everett says, I have a 1962 Epiphone Texan, not a reissue. I've recently cracked it in the lower bout. Okay, I dropped it. The cracks do not affect the sound or playing. It is way down on the lower side. Should it be cleated? What effect does it have on the value? Well, since I don't have a picture of it, I can't tell you how bad it looks right now. Send me a photo, george@guitars.com, and I'll have more of an opinion. But if it's cracked, it is a structural issue, which also, if untended, could spread and get much worse. The area is weakened, and a small tap might cause that crack to just dramatically explode out. So yes, it should be seen by a competent, good professional repair technician. And by good, I mean somebody who is skilled, knows what to do, knows how to do it, and also knows what not to do. There's too many people try to do it themselves. And if you don't know how to do it, you can make a real mess out of things that might have otherwise been quite simple. So I do see things that we would have known how to fix in 5 minutes, where somebody tries to do it themselves and creates a $1,000 plus problem. So don't venture into doing something that you absolutely don't know how to do. Pay somebody else who does know how to do it, or at least get their advice before you attempt to do something where you're not sure what to do. But how much devaluation there is depends on how bad the crack is, how unsightly it is, how big it is, how much it affects structural integrity. And I don't have enough information yet to answer that for you. Michael Gorsuch says, I have a Gibson ES-143 quarter, believe around 1956, needs some loving care. What do you recommend? Well, I don't know what it needs. When you say it needs loving care, send me some photos. Does it need loving care because it's been abused and needs restoration? Does it need loving care because nobody's playing it and needs a good home because it's lonely and unhappy at not being used for anything? Don't know. But the 143 quarter has a short 22.5-inch scale. It is a fine guitar for kids to learn to play. It's also plenty good as an adult toy if you tune it up over standard pitch. Because at that scale, it's going to sound a bit floppy and not its best tone at standard pitch. But if you tune it 2 or even 3 frets above standard, it'll hold electric guitar strings that are lightweight. They can take that tuning real easily, especially with the short scale. It'll have a more normal tension and it'll sound really good. And there are some arrangements. It's fine to have a somewhat higher pitched guitar. The Germans used to make what they call a Terz guitar, T-E-R-Z, and it was tuned up from standard and it could do harmony parts. So the 143 quarter is a guitar that can be very good utility, tuned up a bit. But again, what does tender loving care constitute in this case? I don't know why it needs tender loving care, but if it's been abused, then it needs to go to a better home. Jim Albrecht, what are your thoughts on Rickenbacker electric guitars of today as compared to the British invasion era instruments of the 60s? Seems they have been able to hold up to construction standards pretty well. Rickenbacker is a very small company, and they never were highly automated before, and they aren't now either. On some of their reissue instruments, they're doing quite a good job. I was a dealer for them briefly, and my problem with them is they weren't willing to supply enough for us to be of any use. They were so back ordered that they would give us a credit limit of $8,000, which wasn't, they wouldn't take more than that in orders. It wasn't enough to make any difference whether we had them or not. So it wasn't worth continuing having the dealership. Tony Marcus says, I have Doug Green's old Stromberg G5, which has a very interesting sound, but neck width 1 19/32 inches, which makes it basically unplayable. I'm likely to have a new neck made while preserving the old one and wonder if all G5s had the very short 23.5 scale. The answer is yes, they all had the short scale. And while it is possible to put another neck on it, I'd certainly recommend you better keep that old neck. And as to it being unplayable, no, it's unplayable for you. That doesn't mean it's unplayable. It was very playable for the people who played the style of music for which it was designed. And if you spend the money to put another neck on it, it may or may not sound to suit you. You should definitely not do anything that's unalterable. And don't count on it being worth more money converted than it is right now. But they did all have that short scale on that model, at least all that I've ever seen. And so there's one question now that I'll cover, and then after that we'll be done. And that was a question about my musical background. Curious about your early music experiences that drew you into guitars. I gather you were listening to folk music in the late 50s, early 60s, but was it the more traditional old-timey musicians or initially the more popular like Kingston Trio or Peter, Paul and Mary? It was definitely the traditional ones. I couldn't stand the Kingston Trio and that type folk music. Didn't like it then, don't care for it now. But it certainly was music that helped to have a guitar boom, and it sure as heck did help Martin and Gibson and other makers of guitars guild to keep them going. So that was a very important music influence. What attracted you to the University of Chicago folk scene? Ever consider studying folklore academically? I've not considered studying that music academically. I was more interested in the instruments in some ways than studying that music. But at the University of Chicago, they had a very active folklore society. When I was a student there, I was a member of the Folklore Society. They sponsored concerts. They had an annual folk festival as well as numerous concerts. It was some of the greatest musical experiences I've ever had, and it was very important in getting me interested. I had friends in college, but also friends in high school before I ever played a note on a guitar. In high school, I collected snakes, not guitars. Collecting snakes since I was 8 years old. I still got 20 of them in my office. But while I know snakes extremely well, my career has been with guitars, banjos, mandolins. My mom always said I shouldn't put all my money in guitars. I should be diversified. So I told her not to worry. I have banjos and mandolins too. It says you've mentioned having been friendly with Mike Bloomfield. Were you also able to hear Chicago electric blues greats in the West Side clubs like Teresa's or Pepper's? Or were they not quite tourist friendly in those days? Well, I don't know if they're tourist friendly is the answer. They were in the black neighborhoods that were not necessarily safe for most white boys to be there at night. But I did get to hear these bands because after the Butterfield Blues Band with Bloomfield as a member played a few concerts at the University of Chicago, all of a sudden the folk or society decided electric instruments were okay, and this stuff in the middle of their own area on the south side of Chicago was culturally significant, and we got to hear lots of that at the University of Chicago. So I saw almost all of the famous R&B players in Chicago, and I remember them very well. They are very influential, and to this day, they are a very important influence on all the music that followed in electric guitar. Anyway, that's it for this week. Keep sending the questions. Any that you send in will be considered for next week. And if there's one that I've not covered and you want to talk to me personally, pick up that phone. Call me 615-256-2033 here at the shop, and I'll talk to you and give an answer. Or email me, george@guitars.com. Some questions may not be suitable for an audience, but they may be suitable for one-on-one conversation, and I'm happy to do that. Call me or email me, george@guitars.com or 615-256-2033. I'm here and I'll talk to you. Have a good one.